Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, I'd like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it, and some of the comments and video ideas I've been getting have been absolutely incredible, so everybody, please keep up the good work. And if you're new here, smash that like button, and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys, it really helps out a lot. And I do have one last announcement I do need to make. I actually did create a Patreon page for the Historic Travels YouTube channel, so if you would like to check that out and help support the channel a little bit more, there is a link for that down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. All right, now this is going to be another what if or discussion video on what would have Titanic had done if the sinking had played out a little bit differently. And for those of you who are wondering, Edmund Fitzgerald is coming, so please don't worry about that. That video should come out later this week sometime. All right, so for the topic for this video, as we all know, Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline, and it breached 6 of Titanic's watertight compartments at the front of the ship. So for this video, we're actually going to cover what if Titanic had struck the iceberg and got the exact same amount of damage, 6 watertight compartments breached. However, it didn't happen at the front of Titanic, it happened at the back of the ship.
Well, to put it bluntly, it would have been an absolute disaster. You see, the first 4 compartments at the front of the Titanic that were opened up by the iceberg were essentially just cargo holds. No machinery was inside those first 4 compartments that was essential to the functions of Titanic. It wasn't until you get to the 5th and 6th compartments where you would actually start to hit the boiler rooms that were essential for Titanic's machinery and systems to function properly. And you see, because the iceberg damaged Titanic in this manner, this was the main reason why no one knew that the Titanic was in trouble for such a long time, and why the ship held up so well the way it did. As I mean, in the beginning parts of the sinking, the lights didn't dim, everything seemed normal, the ship was just slowly starting to develop a list. However, if the Titanic had taken the same amount of damage at the back part of the ship, things would have been completely different. Okay, so try to follow my logic here a little bit. The way I designed this was I essentially divided the Titanic's back sections up into individual compartments, just like they were on the ship, and I used these red lines to indicate where possible iceberg damage would occur if the Titanic had struck the berg at the back, similar to the front. Now, as you can see, the first 4 compartments, that's just simply the propeller and the propeller shaft, which the machinery on the ship used to turn the propeller. However, compartments 5 and 6 house Titanic's engine room and the main electrical turbine. So this is where Titanic would have really got in trouble if it would have struck the berg at the back of the ship instead of the front.
So Titanic's main engine room and the room that holds Titanic's main electrical turbine, those are essentially the 2 most important rooms on the ship. If those 2 rooms flooded very quick, then that means the Titanic would lose all electrical power and be plunged into total darkness. You see, without those 2 rooms, none of Titanic's systems would function, with the exception of the telegraph, but I'll cover that in a second. So, if those rooms were gone, then honestly, that extremely limits the people on board the ship's ability to A, launch the lifeboats, and B, try to fight the flooding. You have to remember, most of Titanic's pumps were located in those 2 rooms. So maybe if the flooding wasn't too severe in those rooms initially, they could try to fight off the water and keep that room from flooding for a time, which would keep the ship's lights on for a little while, nowhere near as long as the way they really did. But if those rooms flooded so quick that they'd have to abandon them immediately, then Titanic's lights would go out probably within 5 to 10 minutes after the iceberg impact, because without the main generator or the Titanic's engines, you know, there's nothing to power the ship. So Titanic would have sunk that night in absolute total darkness.
So if Titanic's power had failed and the entire ship was plunged into darkness, the Marconi wireless Morse code machine would be the only device on the Titanic that would still function. You see, while it did run off of ship's power, it did have an emergency battery backup system that could be used in a crisis, hence a ship loses power. So the Titanic would have been able to call for help. However, the range of the wireless when running on battery power is extremely limited. Titanic's wireless system can transmit a signal under normal circumstances, hence having full power. It can send a signal roughly 300-400 miles away, give or take. But you see, under battery power, Titanic's wireless system can only transmit a signal up to 50 miles or so. And you see, the Carpathia, Titanic's rescue ship, was barely within the 50-mile range. So if Titanic actually had to transmit a distress call using the battery backup system, there's a chance the Carpathia would have never heard Titanic's distress call.
You see, a big reason why 700 people survived the sinking of the Titanic was because of how well the ship actually held up throughout the course of the sinking. You know, the lights stayed on, essential systems stayed working, and so on. But if those systems had failed, hence a reverse sinking, like the generators going down and everything, imagine how much of a nightmare that would be for the passengers and crew. Imagine being a crew member on the Titanic and trying to launch lifeboats in pure darkness. Imagine being a passenger trying to evacuate the ship and navigate all of its corridors and passageways in total darkness. I mean, honestly, I don't even know if 200 or 300 people would survive the night. And I mean, trying to get the lifeboats launched with, oil lamps or whatever other tools they had to emit some lighting. I mean, honestly, it would be a disaster. The only reason so many people were able to survive the Titanic was because of how the ship went down. In a reverse sinking scenario, I don't even think we'd have half as many people survive.
And you see, that brings up another point. If the Titanic was sinking in a reverse scenario, hence back first, I think the Titanic would end up sinking much quicker than it did in reality. And what do I mean by this? Well, you see, it has to do with the Titanic's center of mass. The Titanic's center of mass is not the center of the ship. It's around the heaviest object on the ship. And you see, the two heaviest objects that were on board Titanic and located in Titanic's stern were Titanic's two massive engines. And you see, because these two heavy engines were located in the stern of the Titanic, that's the reason why the Titanic's stern didn't really start to climb out of the water until the ship was in its literally last 5 minutes. But you see, if these two heavy engines would have been one of the first points of the Titanic to flood, and the much lighter bow section was the last part to go under, the sinking of the ship could have turned out much differently.
You see, one thing you have to remember, water is extremely heavy. So I think that those massive engines and how heavy they were helping offset the weight of water that was coming into the front of the ship. And the weight of those engines was helping keep the Titanic more stable. You see, even though the water was trying to pull the Titanic's bow down, the ship was also keeping the ship more stable because there was so much weight at the back of the ship fighting to keep the Titanic on even plane. So it was kind of like a tug of war. The water trying to drag the front of the ship down while the engines in the back trying to keep the Titanic level, so to speak. And you see, I think the engines were a big reason why Titanic broke in half, because they were so heavy. Remember, the Titanic's stern didn't start to climb up out of the water till very close to the end. So I think that the weight of the engines at the back of the ship, plus the weight of water at the front of the ship, and then you've got this little section right here that's kind of dry, there's no water in there, that became the critical weak point. So that one section of the ship that's trying to support both the engine and the bow just couldn't take the strain anymore, and the Titanic broke in half. Now, if the engines would have ended up flooding first, and the back part of the ship would have ended up flooding first, and all of this massive weight, the weight of the engines and the weight of the water, ended up going down first, I don't think the Titanic would have made it an hour. I think it would have dropped and sunk so quickly. And I also don't think the Titanic would have broken in two either. I think because all that weight was at the back of the ship, there would be no tug of war, so to speak, between the bow and the stern. I think the Titanic would have just went down like this, the stern or the bow rising up out of the water, and I think she just would have kind of went up and, like, say my hand's the water line, I think she just would have went up in the air and then just kind of did like a little spiral effect and just went down like that. That's what I think would have happened if the Titanic would have been breached at the back of the ship.
And you see, if you really pay attention at this animation, you can see where the hull of Titanic, right by the funnel that's about to go into the water, you can see it beginning to bend as the dead weight of the bow is trying to drag the stern vertical, and the weight of the engines is trying to keep the stern from climbing too high into the air.
One thing I tend to realize more often when I'm making these what-if videos is just how rare and unique the Titanic was. And you see, what I mean by that is the Titanic struck the iceberg in such a way, and the flooding proceeded through the ship in such a way, that it gave the crew time to evacuate all the people. And you see, because the Titanic was flooding the way it did, the power stayed on, the lights were on, the Titanic had time to call for help, and the crew had a relatively easy time launching the lifeboats. But you see, if the Titanic had started sinking in just a little bit different way, hence the stern going down first, things could have been totally different. It's because the power stayed on that the crew was able to call for help, keep the passengers calm, get the lifeboats away. And it's because of how the ship sank and the time they had that they were actually able to, launch the lifeboats and save the 700 people who made it. If any one little thing had been different with the Titanic, it's possible we could have had a much greater tragedy than what we really did. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. And I have to say, I really enjoy doing these what-if videos, trying to analyze the sinking and talk about what could have happened if something had played out just a little bit differently. It's very challenging, and it helps me understand the sinking of the Titanic better, because it helps me, okay, so this is what really happened, but if you change this one little detail, then this could happen. So I feel like it brings us a little bit closer to the story of the Titanic, because we learn about her and we understand the ship better. But yeah, anyway guys, that's it for this video. And hey, if you like this content and you want to see more like it, let me know in the comments below. If you have any video ideas, please let me know. And if you want to check out my Patreon as well, there's a link for that down below as well. Anyway guys, hey, keep saying the video ideas. If you're new here, please subscribe and please give my channel a like and like the video if you like the content. All right, everybody, well, hey, you stay safe out there and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, I'm back real quick. Right as I was editing this video, I had one last idea about the whole sinking reverse scenario that I did want to share with you guys really quick. So just think about this for a second. If we assume that 6 compartments at the back of the ship were damaged in the iceberg impact, and 2 of those compartments were the engine rooms, well, Titanic could stay afloat with 4 compartments breached. So my idea was, if the flooding wouldn't have been too severe in the engine room, and remember, those were the rooms that actually had all of Titanic's pumps, maybe they could have even kept the Titanic afloat indefinitely. Like, those first 4 compartments that held the propeller's mechanism and the propeller shaft, they would have been gone. But if they could have kept the engine room and the main turbine room from flooding with all of Titanic's pumps, there's a chance they could have, you know, kept the Titanic afloat long enough to get everybody off, or maybe even keep the ship afloat indefinitely and have another ship tow the Titanic back to port. Interesting, I just thought of that. Anyway, guys, I just thought that was a cool little idea and I wanted to share it with you. All right, everybody, well, hey, y'all stay safe out there and I will see you in the next one.